is to look at the economic analysis that underpins the crisis. I'm going to move away from the microphone, so I'll raise my voice a little bit. I hope I can be heard. But as you see here, this is a chart published by the Congressional Budget Office in its most recent forecast, and very closely resembling the kinds of documents that the Office of Management and Budget will be working with, since Peter Orszag, who now heads the OMB, came from the CBO. And what it measures is something called the output gap, or the difference between actual GDP and the potential, which is this horizontal line, on a scale going back to 1945. So periods of great prosperity, like the Johnson administration, the late Clinton administration, show up as periods when output is above potential, and the great slumps here in the Reagan administration and at present show up as periods well below potential. So you've got an idea. This comes up to the present, and then there is a forecast up to 2015. Well, you can clearly see two things about the way in which the analysis is guiding thought on this subject. One is that they do not expect the present crisis to produce a slump deeper than 1981-82. This is not deeper than this, about 8% of GDP at the worst. Right? And the second is that they expect, and this is a baseline, this is based on the assumption of no change in policy, so it's before the enactment of H.R. 1, which hasn't happened yet, that a turnaround will occur at the end of this year and then proceed steadily until you're back up to normal by 2015. And you have to ask, why do they think that? It is a case, it seems to me, of the mindset and the thought process of conventionally competent economists, working with the body of statistical evidence from the post-war period, which is the only body of statistical evidence they have as raw material for this kind of model. And so they look at the depth of recessions in the past, and you cannot, by that methodology, make a prediction that the recession will be deeper, even if you have pretty good reasons for expecting that it might be. You're not going to get there. Secondly, they do expect this to be somewhat longer than past recessions, which had large policy intervention, because this is the baseline. But they expect the turnaround to occur at a time normal for post-war business cycles. That is to say, the NBER will tell you when the recession started, and they're now saying December of 2007. There's a certain normal length, and at the end of that time, they expect a turnaround to occur. So in other words, what we have here is a forecast against which policy is being calibrated, a forecast which takes no account of the fact that this is a financial crisis of an unprecedented type. And that, it seems to me, is wrong. And you can see this just last Sunday. The chairman of the Council of the National Economic Council, Larry Summers, was on Meet the Press, and I got the transcript, and he talks a little bit, quite candidly, about what they did. And you can see, again, apparently reasonable procedure. We talked to a lot of experts, both Democrat and Republican. And you know, frankly, some of them think the stimulus should be larger, and some of them think the stimulus should be smaller. The president balanced the different views, and I think came to the approach that we've taken. Well, this will be a correct formula if it is the case that the body of professional economists, group of professional economists as a group, don't make systematic errors. But how many of them forecast this crisis in the first place? No problem. Well, they're basically a cautious, conformist group. That's how they got tenure at universities. And in an extreme situation, the average of their point of view is certainly going to be wrong. It's certainly going to be wrong. I'm not saying it's an unreasonable procedure. It's an excessively reasonable procedure. What is needed is not the consensus of professional views, but, you know, a Rasputin. Or at least a Nancy Reagan. So you can read the tea leaves and tell the president what to do. Nancy Reagan, for that matter, is still available. Quite seriously, if this is, in fact, a candid appraisal of how things have been done, we're going to find that the results are not going to be satisfactory. And then there's another problem, which is how this team and the previous Treasury team is making the connection between what they're doing with spending and taxes and the banking system. And I think the problem stems from the way in which they conceptualize, the way in which they think about what the banking problem actually is. It's a problem of metaphors and of summarizing too quickly and becoming to believe that the metaphors have explanatory power. So here's what Larry Summers said. He said, it's why we focus on the flow of credit. And capital adequacy is part of what you do to maintain the flow of credit and to permit the increased lending that I think everybody agrees that the economy requires. What's the metaphor there? It's a plumbing metaphor. The pipes are clogged, or they're frozen, but they're clogged. The solution is to take a plunger to the pipes, or a blowtorch to them, to warm them up, unfreeze them, and then credit will flow. It will flow from high to low, like water, which gives you an idea of how Larry Summers conceptualizes the role of banks. They sit up there and credit flows down to us. But credit isn't like that. Credit is a contract. Credit is a bilateral agreement. It requires a lender who is willing to lend and a borrower who is willing to borrow. Well, who's willing to borrow in the present environment? Not very many people. People want to be in cash. They want to be in treasuries. They don't want to put down their reserves on something risky, like the deposit that would be required to justify a car loan or a new down payment on a home. They're not going to put themselves at risk in this environment. So the banks could be willing to lend and find that nobody's coming to the door who's willing to borrow. And then there's another problem. That even if the lender is there and willing and the borrower is there and willing, the borrower has to qualify. There has to be an asset that can be used as collateral in most cases. And that asset, usually in the household sector, is a house. Right? The only thing against which you can borrow and deduct the interest on your taxes. Right? Well, what's happened to the value of houses? The value of houses has fallen, and many, if not most cases, now sits below the debt that already encumbers the asset. With the result that the bank cannot prudently lend on that asset. It doesn't have any security for the loan. So this situation is a little more difficult. No, I'll say a lot more difficult than we are conceptualizing in dealing with this crisis. You know, I've spoken already at great length, and I'm happy to